Hey y'all, I'm back. Okay, so really important reading that you had from Marlene Fry. It's called Oppression. And even though Fry is talking about gender oppression in her essay, I think her ideas or concepts about oppression can be applied to any kind of oppression, whether it's heterosexism or social class oppression or racism, right? And I say this because oppression, first and foremost, has to be understood as structural, right? So, oppression is something that exists at a systemic level. It is not just the interpersonal that we are talking about, it is not just one's own identity that we're talking about, but we're talking about macro structures, right? That maintain status quo, in this case, patriarchy, that make it just seem natural, right? That make it seem like this is the way the world works. The very interesting point that Fry is making is that human beings can be miserable without being oppressed. So in a patriarchy, men can be miserable. Indeed, even Kimmel argues that patriarchy has many negative consequences for boys and men, right? So boys and men are not just the perpetrators of violence, but also often the victims of violence. Men in our society are also engaged in more risky behavior, such as drunk driving, violence, right? And so Fry is arguing that men in a patriarchy can be miserable, however, that's different from being oppressed. And she clarifies that to oppress means to restrain, restrict, immobilize, or reduce. And her claim is that men don't encounter structures that are designed to limit their mobility, right? So even when you say that there are many men who were being killed in wars, etc., the institution of war in many ways is celebrating masculinity, right? It's glorifying masculinity. So those are structures that don't necessarily have any impact on the mobility of men the same way that they do for women. Okay? And again, I'm looking forward to debate and discussion on that on our discussion forums, right? But oppression has to be understood as structures, as systemic. And to make it more accessible, Fry uses the analogy or the metaphor of a bird cage. And Fry says, if you come up really close to the bird cage, you essentially have a microscopic view. You can see a single wire, right? And you might even think, well, this seems like one flimsy wire, what's the big deal, right? But then when you step back, you get a macroscopic view and you see wires going every which way. And you start to realize that when we talk about oppressive systems, there's a cumulative effect that's happening that locks the marginalized groups into place, that maintains status quo. So having that macroscopic view becomes really important. To explain further, Fry says that women in a patriarchy often face a double bind. So double bind is essentially like a catch-22. A catch-22 situation is like a lose-lose situation. And you can consider some examples of this. So for instance, from the time that we have little girls in our society, they are given these little baby dolls. They are told to be sexy, right? So if you're going to be worth anything, you better look sexy for the male gaze, right? You just look at Halloween costumes if you're still wondering what I'm talking about. And they are sexualized for little toddler girls. So girls in our society get that message very early on. If you want to be worth anything, you better be sexy in particular ways. And then they might be adolescents now. Now they're ready to go off to college. They go to a college party. Unfortunately, maybe sexual assault happens. And then at that point, what's the narrative in our society? What is wrong with you? Why were you wearing such a short dress? Why were you drinking? Right? So very quickly, it devolves into a blaming the victim narrative. And the point I'm making is that it's a catch-22 situation. If you want to be worth anything, you have to be sexy. And then when sexual assault happens, the argument is, why were you so sexy? You brought this upon yourself. Similarly, if you look at the corporate world, you have very few, handful of women who are CEOs or in authority positions. And often the argument is, well, maybe she lacks gravitas to make it to those top positions. Or maybe she's not assertive enough, not really a leader. The flip side of that is she's too bossy. She's a corporate bitch. She's too hard to work with. She's belligerent, right? So hopefully you're starting to get this idea of the catch-22, the lose-lose situation, which Fry calls the double bind. So it's talking about this complex tension that marginalized groups in an oppressive system experience, right? This is the reason that Fry disapproves of the door opening ritual. She thinks that it's obsolete. It's something that we need to be done with, right? Where men in our society are socialized to think that that's the chivalrous thing to do. Fry says this infantilizes women, like they're children, they can't open the door for themselves. And more importantly, I feel Fry is pointing out that it's fake helpfulness, because where are the men when we need the laundry done or help with childcare? Where are the men when we are trying to fight for equal pay, right? So those are the crucial moments when we need that support, those allies. And unfortunately, that sometimes doesn't really come through, right? So I think in our present generation, perhaps everybody opens the door for whoever's coming behind them. It's just the polite thing to do. But she's using that example just to illustrate again that sometimes you have these chivalrous norms, etc., that ring hollow when you look at the gender inequality in our larger systems. This is just a great illustration to show you how the criteria we use to evaluate women has not really changed over centuries. So in the first one, you see the example of a witch hunt. If she dies, she's innocent. If she survives, she's a witch. So it's like an impossible situation. And you fast forward to present times. If she seems okay, nothing happened. If she claims it was an assault, she's just seeking attention, right? In reference to the Me Too movement. And indeed, unfortunately, we've seen a big backlash against women who were brave enough to come forth during the Me Too movement, unfortunately, have been stigmatized. Oops. These images, again, are pretty disturbing. So in the first one, you see the image of Barbie that we give to our little girls to play with, has been heavily critiqued for a long time. In fact, Barbie was modeled after a German sex doll. And so again, just thinking of that is pretty disturbing, that that's what we give our little girls to play with. And in present times, of course, we've seen some changes in like different shapes and forms, colors for Barbie. But a lot of it still remains really problematic. Here you see the Brat series. Here you have a baby in mascara, I think, with a purse. And then the fashion industry in general has been notorious for using underage and underweight models. So you see sort of a sexualization of girls younger and younger. The documentary that I'm assigning for this week, Killing Us Softly, does a great job of pointing out the sexual objectification of women and connections with that objectification and violence against women, right? So you'll definitely have a discussion post on that where you can discuss what is the connection between objectification, dehumanization, and then violence, right? And then the flip side of that would be the infantilization of women. So sexualization of girls and infantilization of adult women are two sides of the same coin. They both tell us that we should find youth, inexperience, naivete, sexy in women, but not in men. And you have to ask yourself why, again, right? So sociologists always asking ourselves why. It reinforces power and status difference between men and women, right? Where weakness, dependency, and their opposite gender traits are seen as desirable in one sex but not the other, right? And all of this comes as like already naturalized. Here's another disturbing image where literally the sketches that you have in the fashion industry would look like this in real life. So again, these images have a big role to play in terms of our own identities, how it affects each and every one of us, even the ones that think that we know this is photoshopped and we know that, this isn't rational. If you're bombarded with these images day in and day out, it leads to all kinds of issues with body image, eating disorders, right? Self-esteem, all of these things. And we see those consequences again, tragically, in younger and younger girls, pre-adolescent girls, already starting to worry about body weight and so on. So in our next mini lecture, we will talk about masculinity and homophobia. We'll base our discussion primarily on the documentary Tough Guys, which does a fabulous job of looking at the links between how we socialize our boys and men and just the norm of sexualized violence against girls and women.